Welcome to the first Daylight Saving Time edition of Public Programs at the Massachusetts Historical Society. I'm Catherine Allgore. I'm the president here, and welcome to you all. We've got a real treat tonight. Usually when I do these introductions, I speak as from my exalted position as the president of the Massachusetts Historical Society. But tonight, I'm just a fangirl. So long before I was a president, I was a historian and scholar. And I had the good fortune to sign up to receive the Nathan Raab's website, his online sort of newsletter. And I would scour it for Dolly Madison letters and James Madison letters. And it was always really exciting. So when I finally met him, because he does work with us at the Historical Society, it was like a celebrity sighting for me. And I think when you get to the end of this program, you're going to feel the very same way I did. Usually at this point, I also tell you to go to our website, masshist.org, for lots of cool stuff, including ways you can be members of the family. But I also invite you to follow and like the MHS on our social media platforms, which include Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And there you'll find updates and collection highlights and stuff about Massachusetts history. And for links to all of our social media platforms, do check masshist.org. And if you're live tweeting this program, and I hope you are, please use the hashtag MHS1791. That's MHS1791. That's for 1791, the year we were founded. But let's get started with the hunt for history. Gavin, take it away.
Thank you, Catherine. And I'd like to welcome everyone to the program this evening. My name is Gavin Cleespies, and I am the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. If anyone is joining a MHS program for the first time, I'd like to mention that we are, in fact, the oldest historical society in America. As Catherine mentioned, we were founded in 1791 and have been an independent nonprofit institution dedicated to collecting, preserving, publishing, and sharing our state and our nation's history for the past 230 years. During the time of the COVID pandemic, we have been very active with programming. We host both public programs for the general audience and seminars that are geared at a more academic audience. And in your average week, we're hosting 2 to 3 programs a week. Check out our calendar for other programs that we have coming up. As Catherine mentioned, we have been offering all of these programs for free, but we're only able to do that thanks to the support of our members and donors. If you enjoy our programming, I hope you'll consider donating to support our work. This evening, we are joined by the author Nathan Raab, who will be presenting on his book, The Hunt for History, on the trail of the world's lost treasures, from the letters of Lincoln, Churchill, and Einstein to the secret recordings on board JFK's Air Force One. So please join me in welcoming Nathan. He is going to give a 10 to 15 minute presentation, and then we'll have a conversation followed by taking questions from the audience. So Nathan, if you'd like to join us.
Well, thank you so much for the kind words and for welcoming me. And I didn't know I had fans, but I'll take as many fans as I can get. And in the interests of time, let me launch right in on a daily basis. But not only what I do, what I came into when I joined the business. My dad started this business when I was a kid, and I sort of grew up with history around me. And the very first thing that he did when I came into this business was to tell me that the most important thing, the very basic operation, is to be able to authenticate a document. Can you tell if something's real? Because if not, then you can't get into the more fun stuff. And he showed me something like this. These are 2 documents of Abraham Lincoln. One of them is authentic and one of them is not. The authentic one is one that we owned in the past. The forgery is one that was offered to us. We get people offering to sell us material almost every day, multiple times a day. And to be able to tell the difference of one versus the other. What we look for is fluidity of handwriting, the appearance of a natural pen to paper, not somebody who's tracing. Shaky letters are a warning sign, unless you're John Adams or John Quincy Adams, but only very, very late in life when their handwriting got very shaky. And at the top, you see what looks to me to be more of a traced note of Abraham Lincoln from 1865. The bottom has a great deal of fluidity. So don't let old paper or older looking pen fool you. A lot of these things remained in great condition, but the top is, just look at the S of send. And the next is Washington. And again, you're looking for straight lines. They knew how to write in straight lines back then. Fluidity of ink, no odd bubbles or bumps. And the top loses again. The top is a forgery by Robert Spring, who I believe also forged Adams documents. And the bottom is an authentic document. The top we actually own and sold as a forgery. The great forgers have value because they're artists in their own right, as long as you identify them as forgeries and don't try and sell them as originals. So this is kind of how I entered into the business. My dad grew up with it, but in a very different way. My dad, who's still very much involved in the business, some of you may know him. He was collecting since long before this photo was taken by the Asbury Park Press. Here he is with my aunt, his sister, just showing how long he's been collecting. And he tried to pass on his passion for history. For him, it was never about, what's an object worth. It was more about the story that it told, how it spoke to him, what it said about the people. So, he often talks about, how he really likes to get to know these historical figures. His quote is, "I see dead people, but not in the way Bruce Willis did." He's surrounded by history, by the sort of spiritual, moral power of history. And he tried to convey that to us. And this is my dad with the Civil War hat on. I believe it's a Union soldier's hat. We had a reenactment outside of Philadelphia where I grew up. And I would say that that's the hat that he wore to the reenactment, but that was the hat that he wore to everything. That was his hat. I am in a great debate is raging within the family whether I'm wearing some kind of nightgown or light overalls, but I am the kid holding the sword. And he took us to these all the time. We'd go to Gettysburg. We went to Colonial Williamsburg, and he encouraged me to sort of become a part of it. And here is a letter from Colin Powell to me. I wrote Colin Powell twice, and he responded both times. I got in touch with him when this book came out and asked for permission to illustrate this letter in the book, and he was gracious enough to give it. But I wrote letters to a lot of famous people when I was a kid. I wrote letters to Ronald Reagan, things that only kids would be interested in. Like I wrote to Dr. Seuss, who at the time was alive and wrote me back with a drawing of Cat in the Hat. And these are all things that I still have, including this letter. The main question that we get, and I think that sort of the most important thing that the most important skill that you can have in deciding when to acquire something, whether you're a historical document dealer, whether you're acquiring something for a collection, if you're an institution, or you're a collector, is how do you know it's authentic? And that can be a heavily nuanced question, and it's not what most people think. You're not authenticating the signature. You're authenticating the entire context. What you're looking at is a forgery. But for generations, it was thought to be an authentic letter of Abraham Lincoln. It showed up in a dealer catalog. My recollection is that it was $18,000 or $19,000. The dealer was reputable. The letter was published. It was not only published, but it was illustrated. And something looked off to me. Remember, you're looking for fluidity. You're not authenticating the signature. You're looking for context and fluidity. You're looking for straight lines. And this really fails on those two. You need look no farther than the top two lines to know that something's off. Whoever was forging this ran out of space in the top line and started writing downwards. They forgot to cross the X in Executive Mansion. The handwriting appears sloppy to me throughout and slants down, doesn't go straight. And by comparison, this is a real letter of Abraham Lincoln. You can see by the folds how straight that is. The people back then, they knew how to write, they were taught how to write, and even those without a formal, standard education, like Lincoln, still would have, learned the proper way to write and practiced it with some regularity since they didn't have iPhones and computers. And the caption is correct. Sometimes authenticity is not the main thing. It's who wrote it. And so let's start from the premise that Thomas Jefferson signed this document. Well, that's nice. And it is an important document. It's an order to purchase books for what would become Thomas Jefferson's redone Library of Congress, which he took over from John Adams and really bolstered with a relatively large acquisition. And this is the instructions to make that acquisition. But he didn't write the whole thing. There's more than one handwriting on this page. He delegated it to his secretary to write the majority of the document, the last page of which is illustrated here. So Jefferson wrote, "Mr. Duane is employed," but someone else, some unknown figure, wrote the top. It's not in the same hand. And for those of you who know who Jefferson's secretary was at this time in 1802, it was none other than Meriwether Lewis. The only documents that we could find with the handwriting of both Jefferson and Lewis are in the Library of Congress, which is a point of reference that we used to authenticate the document. And we ended up selling this to the Library of Congress, which now owns it. But determining value in historical context is often about, again, you're not just looking at the signature, you're looking at the entire context of the document. I write this slide not to pick on Antiques Roadshow, but to talk about what I mentioned in the very beginning, which is that history goes beyond what's it worth, is it authentic? That is sort of, that's the mechanics, that's the nuts and bolts. But the true inspiration, the reason people buy these things, and the reason that others collect them and research them and rely on them as primary resources is so much more than that. It teaches us about who we are, what came before us. The story of the Allen brothers, Revolutionary War patriots. We were talking earlier about these amazing finds. We went up to a collection in New England with hundreds of documents and ended up being the papers of this Allen family. And Thomas Allen was the hero of the Battle of Bennington. His brother Moses was also a preacher and went south, first to Charleston and then to Georgia, where he was captured by the British and thrown onto a thrown onto a prison ship, a British prison ship, which, although I've never been on one, is evidently not a place you want to end up. He was so unhappy that he attempted to escape by jumping off the side of the boat. But before he did that, he made friends with a man named Mordecai Sheftel, not somebody I'd ever heard of. Someone out there may have. He's a prominent person. I ought to have heard of him. He's one of the most prominent Jewish Americans, colonists during that era, and probably the most important of the era in the Deep South. And he was also captured because he was fighting for the colonial cause. They both ended up on this prison ship, and the two of them, this preacher and this early American Jew, became friends. Poor Moses didn't make it. He drowned trying to escape the prison ship. But they captured this little sheet of paper, a reference from his diary, a scrap from his diary, this and one other piece, which just speaks to the emotional power of historical documents. And when they fished it off him and read it, they realized, I say fish respectfully, pork for dinner. This is from Moses Allen's diary. Mr. Sheftel and son refused to eat their pieces, and their knives and forks were ordered to be greased with it. It is a happiness that Mr. Sheftel is a fellow sufferer. He bears it with such fortitude as is an example to me. I love this. It's obviously tragic what happened to Allen, but the friendship between these two is important, and it's only known because of this little tiny sheet of paper that managed to survive this man's drowning. And you can see from it, or you could, that it's waterlogged. It was waterlogged. All right, to prove to you that we're always being hit with these, this is another forgery. But this is a forgery, and we know it is for a reason which is not a previously shared reason. I'll give you a second. Setting aside the fact that it's not a good forgery, it is written from the Capitol, which is not where Abraham Lincoln was writing letters. The person got the date line entirely wrong. I actually think this is a terrible forgery because the wording, the handwriting, and the date line are all terrible. But it just, again, proving a point, hammering it home, context, context, context. And this is an authentic letter. And you see that Executive Mansion is where the place from which he datelined the vast majority of the letters that you find during the war. This is a letter that I have hanging in my house. It is not the original. I sold the original years ago, but my wife liked the content enough. And now that I have an 8-year-old daughter, she doesn't really pay much attention, but she will. An autograph dealer, a predecessor to me, long ago wrote Susan B. Anthony to try to sell her autographs, but offered her only men, which turned out was not a successful sales strategy. She, rather than throw it away, decided to teach him a little lesson and wrote him back with a letter that we bought and subsequently sold. I know you think women are, by the way, the underlines on this are hers. I know you think women are the pets of society, but to be a pet is not to be an equal. And what I want is for women to be equal before the law in every respect. And if letters like that can't convey, the strong morality that history has to convey, if they can't in some way to contribute to our being better people, more morally grounded people for having seen what others did before us, I just don't know what can. And this is from my book. The Hunt for History is a journey of discovery, a search for further meaning. Jefferson writes the story of our lives. Lincoln's wisdom lights our own path. Churchill's courage gives us strength. Einstein's vision compels us to aspire. We live their stories in our own lives. And I'm going to hammer home the point one final time. How do we authenticate? Context, not signature. And this is why. 1, 2, 3. 3 signatures of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson together. They did sign things together. In Jefferson's capacity as Secretary of State for 2 years, he signed alongside George Washington. These are almost identical signatures. They are accomplished by a very good forger. 1 and 2 are both almost certainly forgeries. And again, the context is when they signed together in what I think is perhaps all, but certainly the vast majority of circumstances, certainly that we've seen on the market. There is space between them. They don't overlap, and the pens are slightly different because they didn't sign at exactly the same time. And in the space, a lot of times was written by the president. In this case, this is authentic, by Thomas Jefferson. Here's the full document. It's a marshal's appointment for Rhode Island, signed by both of them. Here's another one, Washington and Jefferson together, authentic, by the president in the middle, no separation. And here's the full document. It's a ship's passport. They signed these ship's passports together during Jefferson's term. They're very desirable, hard to find. They did sign together, but again, you can see the context matters as much, if not more, than simply the signature. Now, I added this in last minute because I got contacted by a customer of ours who saw this in an antique shop, and the person wanted, I want to say, $80,000 for this document, which is clearly written on laid paper, but is a pretty rough forgery. But I'll give the person credit for having attempted to forge the entire document, not just a piece of it. In any event, it just goes to show these things are sort of around, and why it's important to have that knowledge of authentication. Here's my book. All right. Thank you, Gavin and Catherine and the Mass Historical Society for having me, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I think I kept it exactly 15 minutes.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And I very much enjoyed your book, and it's a fabulous story. And I'm very pleased that you're able to make time to speak with us this evening. So I had, a couple questions for you. And then we probably at about 6:10, 6:15, we will open it up for questions from the audience. So people who are in the audience are welcome to submit their questions using the Q&A function at any point that they'd like, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. And I know that actually there's 3 or 4 questions that have already come in, so I suspect we have a good crowd who's got some good questions. So just to start off, a lot of your work is understanding the historical context of items that others have missed. So, other dealers or the current owner hasn't quite understood the significance of an item. How do you keep expanding your knowledge of history? Are you constantly reading history books? If so, what are some of your favorite reads recently?
I do read. We sort of learn a la carte here. So if we get a document from a certain period of history, we're forced to immerse ourselves in that particular document, in the immediate circumstances surrounding that document, in a way that you couldn't just from a general knowledge of history. I mean, we're at the end of the day, we're generalists, and generalists requires having the ability to not only handle, John Adams documents or George Washington, but also John Kennedy, Winston Churchill, Gandhi, Charles Dickens, Albert Einstein. So there's so much out there in terms of learning more. A lot of it comes from dealing with people like you all, who have an area of expertise and can expand our knowledge and can answer questions. And so for the folks who are involved in the papers projects and at historical societies, we maintain very good relationships with them because they're incredibly knowledgeable, helpful. Their archives are amazing. And, to my mind, they perform an absolutely crucial function. What am I reading now? I'm reading The Count of Monte Cristo, which, I don't think really responds to that, and a book by William James. So I'm not reading a history.
Oh. Yeah, they're good books to read, probably.
But to answer your question, when we get a document, we immerse ourselves entirely in that moment. And so what that means is I often have the most, we just dealt with it with a collection relating to Thomas Eckert, who is an early telegrapher, and it was really important in the history of early telecommunications. And so I had to become, overnight a pseudo expert, and I say a strong pseudo expert in the early history of the telegraph. So I had to go out and buy a bunch of books on the telegraph. So that tends to be how the flow of information.
Fair enough. That's actually very similar to my work. Do you have any boundaries in terms of what you work with? I mean, do you think, you collect from the 17th century to the 21st century, or you collect American and English, but you don't go into, I don't know, Tunisian papers? Do you have any sort of set boundaries of where you go?
Certainly the market is bigger for, the mainstay American and Western European figures. But, there's an active customer base in Gandhi. We've carried documents as old as the 1300s, English vellum documents typically. No, there's not. And we don't handle a lot of musical documents. If you want to buy a letter of Beethoven, we're probably not going to be a resource for you. But otherwise, it's pretty broad. And of course, we only carry what we can authenticate. And since no one here speaks Arabic, it would be difficult for us to, handle a lot of Arabic script papers. Even if someone told us what it says, we couldn't authenticate it ourselves, so we couldn't carry it.
Fair enough. So I watched a recording of a program that you did with Kevin Butterfield from Mount Vernon. And when he asked you to talk about a favorite discovery, you said that the process of uncovering treasures was such a thrill that your favorite discovery was your most recent one. So I wanted to ask, what have you discovered recently that you're really excited by?
We just sold a letter of Wellington written to his Prussian counterpart, arranging an alliance after Napoleon had escaped from Elba to defeat Napoleon the second time. Some of these documents have such a sense of urgency to them. Here's Wellington, the commander of the English forces, who would just shortly after writing this letter, Defeat Napoleon for the last time, writing to his Prussian counterpart urgently. I mean, you can sense in the letter, it's really rather urgent. So yeah, I mean, what is the most exciting thing? It's like, I find the new document, like that's my fix for the next couple days. So it is in a sense, and if I had some of my old friends, as I call them, back here, some of the things that we had that sold, maybe I would feel otherwise. But that Wellington document is just so cool to me. He's on the battlefield writing the letter.
How many collections are you working on at a time? Do you focus on one collection to authenticate, or are you sort of working in multiple directions at once?
You mean from people who are buying from us or selling to us?
Selling, like in terms of authenticating, do you focus just on one collection or one item, or are you working on multiple things during the course of your day?
Sometimes it's one and sometimes it's five. But we don't really, the challenge for us is finding quality material to buy. Once we have the quality material, it tends to sell. And so when you're presented with a collection that is, a quality collection of authentic material that we want to buy, we give it and the seller, the immediacy and respect that they deserve. And what that means is that oftentimes we're sort of juggling, multiple offers and multiple processes at the same time. And, we won't pay for it until it arrives in-house so we can look at it. But they're very rare. I'd say twice a year, something looks authentic from a scan, but ends up not being when we see the original.
So I was just curious, just to put this in context of today, how has the COVID-19 pandemic affected your work? You would think that there are positive sides for you. Many addicts have been cleared out during the pandemic. There's also a huge explosion of people adopting hobbies. And online shopping has gone through the roof. So all of those things could be to your benefit. On the other hand, it's very hard to go check out a collection in somebody's house if you can't go into their house. So I'm just sort of wondering, how has the pandemic impacted your work?
We are fortunate in that we built really a business that existed and thrived online without, before the pandemic. So our work has probably changed less. What's interesting to me, which is a point that you make, and we learned this in 08 and 09, is when the market goes down or people perceive that the market is not strong, fewer people sell. So when the misconception is that people are emptying out their attics right now. I wish that were the case. Not that I wish people had financial difficulty, but I would love the opportunity to buy more material. And the challenge is that people who have the material tend to feel, and they were correct in 08 and 09, they're not correct now, that the market is weak, and so they'll simply wait until the market's strong to sell the material. The reality is that our market is strong, and when they talk about a two-tiered recovery or a two-tiered pandemic, I think that there's some truth to that. The people who could afford to sort of stay home and work, well, they still had the money and they still had the wherewithal, and now they have more time, so they're online, and when I send an email, they're sitting there. So it's I would say the biggest difference for us is there are fewer people selling documents anywhere, certainly to us, but also anywhere.
Great. Well, it's just sort of an interesting thing to check in with different people in different fields about how this unusual year has been treating them.
Yeah.
So in your book, you talk a lot about working with your father. Do you want to tell us just a little bit about the process of sort of your apprenticeship with him, and how you learned from him? Also, I mean, just in context, if you could tell us a little bit about his background, how he got into this, which you do convey in the book, but I think maybe some of our audience don't know.
I'm sorry, you want me to talk about the apprenticeship process?
Yeah.
I mean, it really is an apprenticeship process, and you couldn't read about this stuff in a book and then go out and do it. It took me a decade before I felt comfortable going out on the road, so to speak, and authenticating a document, because the margin for error is small, and you're dealing with real money. So if you walk away and you cut somebody a $50,000 check and it turns out that you bought a forgery, well, my dad's not going to be none too pleased about that. So, you know, there are reference books. There are books written by someone that, or a couple people that people on this call might know. Most of them were written by Charles Hamilton, and I read all of those books. But then it's like, you know, Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book called Blink, where he talks about primarily art forgeries. And, you know, the premise of the book is that somebody who's seen enough things, somebody who has the requisite knowledge, will look at something and know within a blink of an eye whether something looks right and looks wrong. And they will back up that gut feeling with research. But the research will only serve to further their initial gut feeling. And that's the idea of Blink. Further research, the more time you spend on something, is not necessarily, it does not go hand in hand with being more right when you're knowledgeable about something. And it took me a while to get to that point, but I am at that point now. And I think that's the premise. That was the point of the apprenticeship. And, you know, in a sense, the apprenticeship is still ongoing. You know, my dad is involved. I talk to him every single day. I talk to him twice today in the day-to-day operations of the business. And, you know, he's the one who thought to, hey, you know what, Nate? So I said, you know, that's not Thomas Jefferson's handwriting at the top. And he said, you know, his secretary at that point, it was Meriwether Lewis. Now, maybe I might have gotten there, but he just knew it off the top of his head. And granted, this was many years ago. But, you know, he gives me anecdotes like that all the time. So, you know, I'm still learning.
Yeah, and
we get along most of the time.
A good numbers of stories in your book, and I was sort of taken by the story of the Christie's auction of Malcolm Forbes' collection of historical documents that just sort of stood out to me as your dad sort of understanding a value in an item that other people overlooked. I don't know if you want to touch on that at all.
Yeah, I think that when my dad first started this business, you know, he was an attorney practicing out of Philadelphia, and he was a collector. He was an attorney who bought from Joe Rubenfine, Catherine Barnes, Bob Batchelder, Paul Richards. These were sort of the giants in our field back when I was in lower school, primarily lower school, middle school. And he traded up when his first catalog was essentially a list of stuff that he wanted to sell so he could afford to buy better stuff. And it turned out that people liked the stuff that he had bought. And I think that, you know, the ability to tell if something's authentic is one thing. The ability to look below the surface and see what's truly important and why people care is something that comes from my dad's, and now mine, but in the beginning it was my dad, his appreciation for history, his true knowledge of history, and his love of it. You know, if it were up to him, we wouldn't sell anything. You know, we would just buy and not sell it. We need to make a living, and I think that translated into the success of his businesses. You know, he didn't just say, okay, well, which document has the largest headline in such a catalog? It was more which resonated to me. You know, why do I care about this? And if his premise was, and it ended up being true, if I care about something and there's a reason that I care about it, chances are someone else is going to feel the same.
Great. So what happens if you get really stumped by something? Does that ever happen? What's the protocol if you just can't figure out whether something is authentic or not?
There's two, well, there are probably many, but there's two responses that jump out to me to that question. The first is, if I have a doubt of whether there's ink on paper, and this happens maybe twice a year, usually with signed photographs, glossy photographs, but not always. There are rare circumstances in which, you know, whatever process was done to recreate the ink really tricks you. It shines in such a way that it can trick the eye. I send it to our conservator, who's the conservator down at the National Archives, and he uses, you know, anything that requires sort of lab work, we send to him, because he has, you know, all of that stuff, and he has the conservatorial background, which is its own amazing skill. And he can do a chemical analysis both of the paper and the ink and tell me, okay, well, this is the wrong, this isn't right, there's something wrong here. And in fact, we just dealt with that with the Lincoln document, which was perfectly authentic, but ended up being a very well done reproduction. And we sent it down there because we suspected something might be wrong, but he supported that conclusion. And the other is, if something just looks like a really good forgery and it's clearly pen on paper, but we want to, if we want backup information, I was just talking to you earlier about this letter of John Marshall that we acquired. Well, we did acquire it, but I'll get to that in a second. But before we acquired it, I was talking to a man named Charles Hobson, who's the editor of the Marshall papers, and these folks keep detailed lists of where these people were in certain times and which correspondence went back and forth, and a lot of their correspondence, if not most of it, is published. And he was able to tell me that it couldn't have been Marshall because Marshall wasn't in that place at that time. So I would say we do one of two things. If we can't tell, first of all, if we can't tell and we don't think anybody else could tell, we just walk away from it because it's not worth it. If we can't tell, but we think that we can use the expertise of either a scholar in that area or our conservator, a scholar in the mechanical aspects of writing a letter, well, we'll just send it to them and get backup for that.
So just because this story appears in the title of the book, but I wonder if you wanted to tell us the story about the tapes from Air Force One the night after the assassination, right after the assassination of John F. Kennedy.
I don't want to give away too much because you have to read the book to find out how it ends. But I will tell you that Ted Clifton was John Kennedy's chief of staff, or what we think of now as chief of staff. Back then, they didn't have that technical title. And when he passed away, his heirs sold some of the stuff directly to us and sent the rest to a small auction company in Philadelphia. And my dad went down there and saw this audio recording of JFK the day he was assassinated, and it says on board Air Force One. And he speculated that this was before the copy of. So basically, the reason that we know what happened the day of the Kennedy assassination is our primary resources, like the Zapruder film, eyewitness accounts, and this audio tape. This tape, which captured all the recordings going back and forth from Air Force One, which was carrying Kennedy's body. What was sitting in that box, unbeknownst to anyone, was a copy of the tape that had been edited by the Johnson administration for reasons that no one knows, that was 40 minutes shorter than the known copy, which was at the Lyndon Johnson Library. And the reason that survived was that the family plucked it out of the attic, that my dad recognized that it might be something, and that we had a partner who was able to take this reel-to-reel tape, put it into a digital format, so we could sit there holding the transcript of it, of the known version on one hand, and listening to it in the other, and see, okay, well, this was taken out and why. It ended up being such a massive story. I think I was like 27 or 28. I went on back when Piers Morgan had a show on CNN. I went on his show, CNN. The federal government contacted us. Members of Congress had their, feathers ruffled, and I will not give away the end so that you can read the book, but it is it's spellbinding, it's riveting. Just think like Nicolas Cage, but more exciting.
Well, I know the ending, but I'll keep the secret for that. So, in the book and in some of your interviews, you've talked a lot about different forgeries, and I wonder if there is ever, like, how often do you come across a really great forgery, and was there an era of like a heyday for the great forgers? In the book, it seems that right now is not a great era for forgeries, but I'm sort of interested in the craft of that and the people who are really dedicated. So I'm just sort of wondering if there was a period or some really great figures who were prolific.
Yes, there were. I would say, the early part of the 20th century probably saw. I mean, forgery is an art. It's a dishonest art, but it is an art. To be a good forger, I mean, even if I were so inclined, which I'm not. But to be a good forger, it's a skill that I mean, I couldn't do it. It's like being, you know, it's like being the Robin Williams of imitators. You know, you can't, a random person can't do it. You have to, it's an art. And that's why good forgers can fool reputable people, institutions. There's a story which, for time purposes, I cut out from this, but one of the forgeries we found was in the archives of Colonial Williamsburg, which acquired by donation a document which was, you know, to me, clearly a forgery. But it was good enough forgery that it fooled reputable, honest, experienced people. And there are forgeries in almost every library in the world, because some of these guys are really quite good. There's a documentary on Netflix right now, which it relates to the forgery of the Mormon documents. So those of you who have Netflix, I strongly suggest you watch that. In addition to the fact that it's relatively modern compared to some of these old forgers, it makes the case that this guy, Mark Hoffman, well, trying to think if I'm going to give it away. You know what? I'm not going to say anything further, except your question is somewhat answered by that, by the documentary. And I can't remember if it's a series or like a one, but in any event, watch that. It's, I want to say it's Murder Among the Mormons or something like that. It's like, it has that title, but it deals directly with, and it's very much in our area, although specifically with Mormon material, which is not our focus. But some of the people who are interviewed they sort of overlap with in our world. You know, none of the do-badders, the do-gooders. But you know, you saw Joseph Cozy, who would do a forgery of John Adams or Thomas Jefferson or Benjamin Franklin if you bought him a beer at a bar. Charles Weisberg was a good forger. The guys today, it's lazy time for the guys today because it's so easy. It doesn't require a good forger. You take, first of all, it's mostly in the sports and entertainment world. It rarely, you know, does it reach us, a good forger. But you know, you throw something up. Access to information is a good thing and a bad thing. Access to the market is a good thing and a bad thing. People like us are arbiters. I mean, people spend money with us not because they couldn't find something for less, but because, you know, a quality seller will stand between them and a forgery and find better material. But there are certain online sites, which I won't name, where these people can make a small fortune selling sports and entertainment, and they don't have to be good because no one cares. You know, people don't want to know.
So that sort of brings up another point that I had, which was, you know, you are sort of interested in some of the pitfalls of the job, because the job sounds, you know, fascinating. It's like you're traveling around the country and around the world, like looking at these great items and then sort of drawing up these histories and putting together these stories of like why this thing is so important. But there's also a downside, I think. And, you know, you tell a story in the book about purchasing a collection from a man who was in his 80s in suburban New Jersey, and how sort of sad and disappointed he was in the price that you quoted him. And I think that there's the potential pitfall of having to spend a lot of your day telling people that something is a forgery, or that the thing that they have that they think is so important actually isn't as valuable as they think it is. So do you want to sort of touch on sort of how that plays in terms of your sort of emotional health at work?
Well, luckily I get both. So we get the people who think they have nothing, and then we can write them a check that, you know, funds their retirement. So it does cut both ways. But certainly it's more common for somebody to have something that they think is incredibly valuable. And there's that story of this man who had poured his heart into collecting these things and had probably spent the better part of his adult life bragging to his friends who came over that this was worth a fortune, only to find that what he had really, you know, was nice material. And, you know, I think we spent $25,000 on it, but he obviously wanted a lot more. And, you know, he was probably 85-ish or so. And you know, his wife was sitting with him, and it was just like there was no amount of money I could have offered that man, I'm convinced, that would have made him happy unless I gave him $1 million, because his emotional attachment to the process of collecting it far outweighed any dollar figure that I could have assigned to it. which goes to show you how much he cared for the material. But I often wish I hadn't bought that collection because, you know, it just wasn't worth it. It wasn't enough. It just wasn't worth it. The tough one was a woman who had a letter of Washington, which she had saved. I want to say she was probably in her early to mid 70s. She had saved it to help a grandchild go to college. And had it been authentic, I suppose it would have made a solid dent. But she called me and she said, well, I want to come down and show it to you. And she's in Connecticut. And I was like, you do not need to come down. Just send me an image of it. You know, you can save yourself the time. And she insisted that she wanted to come down. So she drove the 6 hours and walked in the room. And per Malcolm Gladwell, within 20 seconds, not even, she took the thing out. And I was like, this is a forgery. And unfortunately, usually when someone has a forgery, we just tell them this is not for us for a variety of legal reasons. We don't want to get involved in some kind of buyer-seller spat where we're not a party. But in this case, I was just, you know, I had to level with her. She was sitting right there. And it was sad to tell somebody who had been holding this, you know, that she was going to have to go home and whatever promises she'd made to her son or daughter or grandson, that wasn't going to happen. So, you know, we get it both ways, but it's more common for people to have an inflated opinion of what they have. And that's kind of reinforced by, you know, Pawn Stars and Antiques Roadshow.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think we can start taking some questions from the audience. Sarah wrote, she said, fascinating look at the secret life of letters. Thank you. And it's a two-part question. She said, how have auction prices changed for certain founders in the past century or so? And is there a holy grail document you're eager to find? This actually combines also with another question who says, you know, whose signatures are most in demand these days? So those two are sort of together in terms of the founding fathers and how have their prices changed, and then separately the holy grail.
So by founding fathers, I read people from the founding period, crossing from the Revolutionary War through, you know, let's say the first couple of years of the, you know, the early Republic. That material has just continued to go up in price. I mean, this is not really a fad-based business. And, you know, there have been a handful of events that have shaken the overall prices. The Civil War, Ken Burns' Civil War special decades ago when I was a kid created a booming Civil War market, which busted for relatively unknown figures today. David McCullough's book on John Adams really created its own market for John Adams documents. And then the modern example, which really is unrivaled with the possible exception of the Civil War miniseries, or I guess documentary, is the Chernow book on Alexander Hamilton, which was made into the musical Alexander Hamilton. And, you know, it's the only fad that I've seen dramatically alter what I would call a steady progression in interest. I mean, we deal in a product for which there is a growing demand. There's more people who can afford it, but a shrinking supply. And the reason the supply shrinks is that people donate their material to institutions or institutions buy them. And once that happens, generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, the material exits the market. So the stuff from the founders has become harder and harder to find, more and more valuable, and that's gone up. With Alexander Hamilton prices, when I first came into this business, which is now 16 years ago or so, you could buy a Hamilton letter as Secretary of the Treasury for like $1,000. And boy, do I wish I'd been buying them for $1,000 back then. You know, I would say that the average letter of Hamilton that we sell is somewhere in the $13,000 to $14,000 range, and that's assuming I can find one. You know, I don't think we have any right now, and that's not because we haven't had them. We've had a number of them. There are a number of people on our mailing list with standing orders to be quoted Alexander Hamilton letters the minute they come in, and I can only attribute that to the book or the musical. So the founder stuff has gone up. The Holy Grail. Listen, I'd love to have a letter of Julius Caesar or Cleopatra. I don't know if that's real. I mean, they did write letters, of course, but finding that I think would be unlikely. the signature of somebody who I think must be out there. It's got to be out there somewhere, and people are looking for it and haven't found it, but it must exist, is William Shakespeare. I mean, the man lived at a time where plenty of documents survive. There are things that say William Shakespeare. I think there are 4 of them in the British Library, and although they're internally inconsistent, the man was a writer by profession. You would think he corresponded with people. He was known in his time. You know, he lived long enough to have written enough things. You would think there would be things out there signed by him. If you were to find now something signed by William Shakespeare, I would consider that to be the holy grail of possibly obtainable signatures. It would sell for millions of dollars, millions.
Yeah. So we have a question from an anonymous attendee who writes, are more modern documents more difficult to authenticate? For example, your Susan B. Anthony letter is a typescript with very little writing except for the signature.
Yeah, so here's where context matters. Susan B. Anthony was long enough ago that you don't have the same issue with slews of secretaries or machines that wrote letters for people. You know, you look for the biggest issue that we have on that front is with the modern presidents, where it can be a real challenge to know whether something's signed by a machine or by a secretary, because they trained to copy the handwriting. You know, there are plenty of reference books out there that will guide you, and experience is a huge help. But you know, look only to today's letters that people received from Donald Trump, or people received from Barack Obama, or people receive from Joe Biden, although he hasn't been in office very long. I just start from the assumption that anything that's typed and then signed with no other handwriting on it is some kind of machine, you know, whether it's printed or there's, you know, an auto pen. I don't know if they've fully gone digital and there's no more auto pen. I don't know the answer to that. But there are more factors. There's more sort of logistical knowledge that's required once you get into the latter part of the 20th century. And again, the same thing goes. If there's a doubt, we just don't buy it. But the auto pen patterns are known, and auto pen often, you know, looks shaky. So, you know, I would say the auto pen is the biggest challenge for people collecting 20th century presidents.
Well, 21st century presidents are going to be even harder, considering.
Not 21st century. I forgot. Is it the 21st century already? How'd that happen?
Yeah. So David wrote, have forgers ever created characters from top to bottom to sell signatures and other associated papers that support the character, i.e. birth certificates, marriage certificates, letters to a spouse, letters of confession of a crime, etc.? So essentially a fictional character.
I have never been, first of all, I think the answer is yes. I have never been quoted something with that much of a backstory. I have been quoted a forgery that comes with like 8 certificates of authenticity. And usually the more certificates of authenticity, the less likely it is to be authentic. But in terms of like somebody going through, yes, I mean, that's happened. I think that does happen a lot in the art world. And it does happen in the historical document world. I've never had the privilege. I mean, I would love that to happen to me because I would buy it as a forgery. And, you know, these forgers, the person who went through that much trouble must have done some really good work. Watch the documentary, watch the thing on Netflix and you'll see an example of someone who was really dedicated to that craft.
So Gail wrote, wondering if you saw any increased interest in or value of documents / signatures relating to Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth K. Stanton, etc. Last year due to the centennial of the 19th Amendment.
No. Simply put, I'm suspicious of fads. Our customer base is very sophisticated, not sort of, they're you know, they're likely to already be, you know, if they wanted a Susan B. Anthony, they would have already bought one. The general public is, I would say the interest in Susan B. Anthony and, you know, people, minorities and women has sort of increased over time as a natural progression of our societal changes, but not as a result of a particular anniversary. So as more, you know, people collect, I think, because they see themselves in history. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the majority of our customers are white men, because the majority of documents that we carry, simply because that is what is available to us, are signed by white men. But as people appreciate more the contributions of minority Americans and people not from America and women, and I mean, the Susan B. Anthony letter really speaks to that. You do see more people, like the person who bought that Susan B. Anthony letter was somebody involved in a nonprofit devoted to women's rights out of New York City. So the husband bought that for his wife, and she is the head of that organization, and he bought that because she saw herself in those figures. But I really can only think of a handful of times when any particular not anniversary event changed, and it's not been an anniversary. It's always been some major entertainment vehicle that's changed it, whether it's the Hamilton book or the McCullough book or the Ken Burns.
Yeah, this might be a little early for the story, but I wonder if the bicentennial had any impact, because that was a big deal throughout the country, and we're of course coming up
in
to
1950.
Yeah,
in 1976.
Yeah,
I wouldn't know the answer to that question.
Yeah, it might be a little early for you, but also probably a little before your father started being too involved in the trade. But so we have a question from Wyman, who said, do you wait for the documents to be brought to you, or do you actively look for them? And then how do you know where to look?
Unfortunately, that's a very good question, and I wish this were not the case, but we have no choice but to wait for the documents to come to us. They are scattered all over the world. I wouldn't even, I start knocking on descendants' doors, looking for material. I think that would be really cost and time ineffective. We don't do that. But the truth is that we probably have 15 to 20 people try and sell us something every single day. So it's not as if there's a lack of people trying to sell. We're just constantly sifting. Some are easy to sift out. No, we don't want that Michael Jordan signed basketball. That's not for us. Some are easy to sift through, and some are borderline, and some are wow, I really want that. But no, unfortunately, we have to wait for people to come to us.
So I think we probably have time for one more question. So Sarah, which seemed to be a popular name this evening, said, you showed several Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln examples. Are those among the most commonly forged? What are other popular forgeries?
Lincoln and Washington are by far the most forged, and the simple reason is the demand and the price are both high. There are more people looking for that stuff, and it's the same reason why there's more forgeries in the sports market and the entertainment market, is those markets are simply bigger. There's more people there to dupe. Yes. Who else is forged? Back in the middle and early part of the 20th century, when people were more widely read and more sophisticated forgers, you'd see forgeries like Edgar Allan Poe. His letters are uncommon. People aren't really doing that now. I don't know who forged those Washington and Jefferson documents. Those were very well done. I would love to buy one of those as a forgery, and I'm a little suspicious. I wonder if they're modern forgeries or older forgeries. I just don't know the answer to that. I've never seen one in person, because if somebody wants to sell you a Washington document and they think it's worth $30,000 and you offer them $1,000, but tell them it's a forgery, that's a hard sell. People, to take somebody from 30 to 1 is, it's hard to convince them of that. They have to be brought to that in time and on their own. Other people, other forgers, other things that people forge: Churchill, Jefferson. It really is American presidential founding, sort of the bigger names. because that's where the money is. I mean, these guys, they're taking advantage of a capitalist system.
Well, maybe someday somebody will open a museum of forgeries. That would be the it would be great to see all that collected.
I would love that. I would love that. That would be great.
I love it. Oh, Nathan, thank you so much. And everybody, you see what I mean? Now you can be fans as well. You can sign up and get messages from Nathan on a weekly basis. And everybody, go into your attics and look for that Shakespeare letter and get in touch with Nathan. Thanks so much. That was great.
Yes. Thank you, Nathan. And I hope everyone has a great evening.
Thank you all.